The honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to join this important debate that is happening tonight, and I want to thank the members for presenting so far. Now, we've had a number of speakers talk about the Subcommittee on Human Rights and about the report, and I have the report here, and I'll be commenting to some degree on it. Speakers have gone on at length in regards to the threat of Iran against Israel, which is very real, and I think people understand that very clearly. The Ahmadinejad regime has repeatedly around the world in different locations through their leader raised these threats that have disturbed much of the world community. There are some that revel in it, and there will always be those. But I want to take a few moments to talk about the regime's threat against its own people. And the previous speaker was speaking somewhat to that. As late as Tuesday of this week, the committee called back some of our previous witnesses to talk about the state of affairs in Iran today. And it's very troubling because we know that the uprising that took place in Tunis and the uprising that took place in Egypt didn't have, especially Egypt. I can remember seeing on television people walking up to soldiers and shaking their hands, and people were free to a certain degree to even surround the tanks and climb on them and mark on them. It's not going to be that way in Iran. There is no doubt that this regime, since 2009, since the elections and the efforts at that time to drive that country more towards democracy, was actually put down. But a stark part of the testimony that we heard, there's something that stays with me, is the fact that in Iran today, every 8 hours, someone is hanged. We need to pause for a second and think in terms of other countries that have had revolutions to get democracy. And the fact that you may have had a war, you may have had military against military, armed people, but this is a civilian population that is being put down and young people's lives taken. So it's very important to pause in our debate tonight to consider these young people. The regime today is, and this is so troubling because we talk about the war on drugs. The United States talks regularly about the war on drugs with the border of Mexico and all that's happening there. Well, in Iran, the war on drugs, the laws on the war on drugs are being used to take out the leadership and to take out the activists that are giving voice to the fight and struggle for democracy. I think, too, part of the context we need to look at is the era of 1979. It was a different time and place. It was a different regime in power. You had a student uprising that was very effective, but the clerics took it over. And now this uprising will be very much at odds with the clerics, who are very much a part of the power structure. So we're into a different kind of push by the people for democracy than in the other countries we've just seen, with a much different government they're facing. And the risk factor, the courage that it requires for these young people, particularly now, after the brutality of the way people were put down following the election, and the disappearance and the tortures and the young people. One woman described how a woman went to pick up the body of her son at a makeshift mortuary in a meat plant, and she found hundreds of bodies in this place when she went in, and many of them were disfigured from various forms of torture. Now, I want to speak for a moment or two, and I know part of it has been put into the record already, but in regards to the subcommittee report, because we held 16 meetings and concluded a report, and as I recall, it was put forward in December of 2010, on the state of affairs in Iran. And I want to read to you a little bit from the executive summary of that report. It says, in the summer of 2009, Canadians and the rest of the international community looked on with concern as Iranian security forces cracked down on protesters in the wake of that country's June 12th presidential election. If you can imagine for a moment what we actually saw on our TV screens was probably to some degree a sanitized version, and only the cell phone pictures and that get out were talking about the reality of what was happening on the streets. And we'll all remember the young woman who was to some extent just standing by when she was shot by one of the security people. And that went out, as they say, virally on the internet, on I believe it was YouTube, where you could go see that. And the sadness that you felt when you saw that young woman's life bleeding away on the ground, knowing to some extent that it was the revolution or the push for democracy that was bleeding with her, because the security forces were being very successful at that point in putting this down and controlling it. And over a period of time, with sadness, we saw it fade. That didn't mean that the people gave up on their need for democracy and their need to stop the tyranny that comes from this particular regime. But that election gave us a very rare glimpse inside of a country that's very controlling. You know, the dramatic protests in Iran last summer and the response of those Iranian forces or authorities, and again, the reaction of the international community put a focus for our subcommittee to revisit that report again, because we at the end of the summer we thought we were finished, and we had to go back and look at it some more in the context of that. And again, as I just indicated, we've done the same thing this week. This is an ongoing tragedy on one hand, but the courage of the citizens of Iran is so uplifting on the other hand. So it draws you back. It's somewhat like that line from The Godfather when they say, well, the man was trying to get out, but it keeps pulling you back. Well, the striving for democracy in that country does exactly to anybody who takes the time to study it or look at it, or even the casual discussions you might have with friends. You can't help but go back to the struggle of those people. So our committee was very concerned with the deteriorating rights in that country. We broadened our study into the mistreatment of the Iranian population themselves, which I think, if you consider the executions, is putting them on the level of China for the number of executions. We tend in the world to point to China as the place of the hugest repression on the face of the earth, but you have to pull yourself back to what's happening in Iran at this point in time and say it's very similar. Now, we heard from expert witnesses and human rights activists representing non-governmental organizations and academics and lawyers, and in light of the testimony, the subcommittee made a number of recommendations. And in our assessment, we assessed the fact that this regime has had a long history of systemic and widespread violations of the human rights of its own people, that the abuses violate the population's right to life, freedom from discrimination based on religion. For example, the Baha'is, the Jews, and the Christians in that country live a very quiet life, trying not to draw any attention to themselves at all because there's huge penalties to be paid. The discriminations to sex, language, or sexual orientation, or political opinion. Now, normally you talk, it's about political parties or when the dissent is out there, but it's just, if you're expressing political opinion that's not in line with the regime, you're opening yourselves to horrific torture. And it should be noted that oftentimes the Iranian regime are violating their own country's laws. That's how far they're prepared to take it. The recording and reporting of these violations has been problematic because domestic human rights organizations are routinely shut down. Government officials and journalists and activists are regularly harassed, and I think it goes beyond harassment in many cases. One of the people that spoke to our committee was Shirin Mbadi, and she's been before our committee twice, and you're struck, very much you're struck by the courage of this woman. And I'm getting the signal I have to wrap up. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm just beginning. I actually had a ton of notes here, and I got a little carried away. But I think that that's the important part of what we have to understand, the need for a passion in support of these people. Thank you, Madam Speaker.